The convoy was 2 hours into the Crimson Barrens when Claire Rowan quietly set down her medical kit, turned to face the empty desert, and said 7 words no one wanted to hear. "There are 12 men behind that ridge." The sergeant laughed. The lieutenant didn't even look up. The driver called her crazy. 4 minutes later, the first RPG screamed out of the dust. By the time the shooting stopped, 3 vehicles were burning, 2 soldiers were down, and every man who had laughed at her was taking orders from a combat nurse they hadn't bothered to learn the name of. This is her story. And it starts long before that ridge. If this story already has you, follow the channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The Crimson Barrens didn't welcome anyone. It absorbed them, swallowed convoys whole, baked equipment into uselessness, turned men irritable and slow and stupid in ways they didn't notice until the moment it cost them. The desert had been doing this for decades before any military unit ever drove into it, and it would keep doing it long after the last armored vehicle rusted into the sand. It didn't care about rank or reputation or how many combat tours a man had stitched onto his sleeve. It was in that way completely honest. The convoy left forward operating base Keller at 0430, 9 vehicles, 42 personnel, 1 assigned route through the flattest and most exposed stretch of ground in the entire operational theater. Standard security escort mission, classified cargo in Vehicle 5. Estimated transit time, 11 hours assuming no contact, which was the kind of optimism that only existed in planning documents. The actual soldiers driving those vehicles knew better. They always knew better. They just kept their mouths shut and drove. Claire Rowan sat in the back of Vehicle 7. She had a window seat, technically, though window was generous. It was a narrow strip of scratched polycarbonate bolted into the doorframe that gave her a smeared view of passing scrubland and orange dust. She wore standard-issue medical gear, desert pattern, nothing to distinguish her from any other combat nurse attached to a security detail. Her rifle was secured between her knees, barrel down, hand resting on the stock out of habit rather than tactical readiness. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't talking. She was watching the ground move past the window with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Corporal Danny Watts sat across from her. He was 23, loud in the specific way that young soldiers get loud when they're nervous and don't want to admit it. And he had been watching Claire for the better part of an hour with the smirking curiosity of someone who had already made up his mind about her. "You the new medic?" he finally asked. Claire glanced at him. "Nurse." "Same thing." "Not really." Watts looked at the guy beside him. Specialist Remy Ochoa, compact, quiet, tattoo of a hawk on the left side of his neck, and exchanged the kind of look men exchange when they've decided someone isn't worth arguing with. "How many deployments?" "Enough." "Enough," Watts repeated, like it was funny. "That's what guys say when the answer's embarrassing either way." He grinned. "Either it's 0 or it's 1, and they walked a wire for 6 months and called it combat." Claire said nothing. She turned back to the window. Watts took this as confirmation of his theory. He leaned back, satisfied, and started talking to Ochoa about something else, some dispute over poker winnings from the night before, and Claire let their voices become background noise. She wasn't offended. She was busy. The desert outside was changing, subtly. The kind of subtle that most people never trained themselves to notice because it required patience, and patience was the first thing military culture beat out of people. The scrub brush on the eastern side had been sparse for the last 40 minutes. Now it was dense, pressing closer to the road, cover that hadn't been there before, which meant terrain that was deliberately different, which meant someone had chosen it. The dust clouds to the north were moving against the wind. Not dramatically, just slightly wrong, like something was pushing through the sand on the other side of a low ridge at a controlled speed, trying not to raise too much of a signature. She filed it away. Captain Nolan Pierce was in Vehicle 3, forward position, where he'd been the entire trip. He was 41, a 13-year officer with 2 combat tours and a chest rack that meant something. He was also currently annoyed, quietly, professionally annoyed, the way career officers get when they've been handed a mission that feels like it's beneath their ability and above their available resources simultaneously. The cargo in Vehicle 5 was above his clearance level. His orders were simple. Get it from Keller to Garrison Base Whitmore without losing it. No deviation. No engagement unless forced. Sergeant First Class Doug Holt rode with him. Holt had a face like a fist and spoke in the clipped shorthand of someone who had long since run out of patience for full sentences. He handled comms, checked their map overlay every 15 minutes, and said almost nothing unless something was wrong. At the 90-minute mark, he said something was wrong. "Captain, radio interference, band 3. He tilted the handset slightly like Pierce could hear the static through body language. "Started about 8 minutes ago. Intermittent." Pierce looked at the map. "We're not near any infrastructure." "No, sir." "Could be terrain bounce." "Could be." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, because saying it out loud would require acting on it, and acting on it would mean stopping the convoy in an open stretch of nothing, which created its own set of problems. "Keep monitoring," Pierce said. "Yes, sir." At the 2-hour mark, the convoy crested a long, shallow rise and came down into the basin on the other side, and that was when Claire moved. She stood up in the vehicle, which you didn't do while moving, which was why Watts immediately started talking, and she pressed her face close to the polycarbonate strip and stared at the ridge line ahead. "Hey, sit down," Watts said, like he was correcting a child. "There are 12 men behind that ridge." Dead silence. Ochoa looked at the ridge. Watts looked at Claire. The driver, a quiet specialist named Brannick, kept his eyes on the road, but his ears went up. "How do you—" Ochoa started. "Dust movement. They're on foot, spread formation, moving parallel to our route. They've been pacing us for at least 20 minutes. She sat back down, smoothly, calmly, like she'd just read something mildly interesting in a magazine. "You should call it up to Vehicle 3. Watts stared at her. "You can see that from—" "Call it up," she said again. Quiet, patient. "Or don't. But call it up now if you're going to." Watts and Ochoa exchanged another look. This one was different. Not smirking, uncertain. Watts reached for the radio. "What?" In Vehicle 3, Pierce heard the report with the skepticism of a man who had heard too many rookies confuse mirages for threats. He asked Holt for his read. Holt's read was inconclusive. The interference on Band 3 was still there. The ridge was too far to positively ID anything. "Who flagged it?" Pierce asked. "Combat nurse, sir. Rowan. She's Vehicle 7. Pierce thought for a moment. A combat nurse who was apparently doing terrain analysis through a scratched vehicle window. "Have Holt do a side scan pass on the ridge coordinates." The side scan came back. Inconclusive. Pierce made the call. "Continue route, log the report." Holt logged it. The convoy kept moving. 4 minutes later, the RPG came in from the northeast, not from the ridge Claire had flagged, but from a buried position 40 meters off the road, which meant there were at least 2 elements, one of which she hadn't seen yet, which meant the ambush was layered, which meant whoever had set it up knew what they were doing. The RPG hit Vehicle 2. The explosion was contained, armor held, crew shaken, but not out. But the concussive wave knocked the lead vehicle's driver sideways, and the vehicle swerved hard into the soft shoulder and buried its front axle. Dead in the sand. Everything happened at once. Small arms fire erupted from the western scrub line, the dense brush Claire had noted an hour ago. 3, possibly 4 positions, staggered for overlapping fields of fire. M240 rounds started chewing through the road surface and kicking sparks off vehicle hulls. Someone in Vehicle 4 was already screaming into the radio. The rear element was receiving fire from the ridge, the original position Claire had flagged, which meant there were now 3 contact points, and the convoy was effectively bracketed. Pierce was out of Vehicle 3 before the second volley, running crouched along the line of vehicles, shouting for status. Holt was already on the radio calling contact to Keller. Vehicle 1 was disabled. Vehicle 2 was drivable, but the crew was shaken. The cargo vehicle, 5, was intact. Driver and escort hunkered down, returning fire into the scrub line. It was controlled chaos for about 90 seconds. Then it tipped into just chaos. The 240 on the western line shifted. Someone had spotted the radio antenna on Vehicle 3 and was now methodically walking rounds toward it. Holt went flat. The antenna took a hit. Band 3 went completely dead. Pierce hit the ground behind Vehicle 4 and did his threat calculation with a fraction of his normal information. He had a disabled lead vehicle, degraded comms, 3 contact points, and 41 other personnel who were all waiting for direction. He was still calculating when Claire came past him at a low run. She wasn't running for cover. She was running toward the disabled vehicle 1, rifle up, moving at a controlled pace that was— Pierce noticed this later, much later, when he had time to think about it. Textbook CQB corridor movement. Not the hunched, adrenaline-fueled scramble of someone under fire for the first time. Controlled displacement. Weight forward, eyes tracking sectors. "Rowan!" he shouted. She didn't stop. She reached Vehicle 1, yanked open the rear hatch, pulled the gunner, a specialist named Torres bleeding from the temple, and got him moving toward Vehicle 4's cover position with one arm while her rifle stayed up in her other hand, barrel sweeping the western scrub line. "Medic!" someone was screaming from Vehicle 6. "I'm coming!" she shouted back. No panic in it, like she was confirming a lunch order. Pierce watched her for a half-second longer than he should have, which was the moment he realized that his threat assessment of Claire Rowan had been completely and categorically wrong. He got back on his feet and started giving orders. The firefight lasted 22 minutes. That sounds short. It wasn't. 22 minutes of sustained small arms contact in a bracketed position with a disabled vehicle and degraded comms is a very long time. It is long enough to make terrible decisions. It is long enough for things to go sideways in ways that can't be fixed afterward. Several things went sideways. Torres, the gunner from Vehicle 1, had a Grade 2 concussion and a laceration above his right ear that was bleeding significantly but not dangerously. Claire had him stabilized and back in a covered position within 4 minutes. She moved to Vehicle 6 next. Private First Class Avery Kellens had a GSW to the left forearm, through and through, nothing arterial, but she was close to shock from it. "Look at me," Claire said. She was already cutting the sleeve. "I can't," Kellens started. "Look at me, not at the arm, at me." She waited until Kellens' eyes found hers. "Good. Keep looking. Tell me something boring." "What?" "Anything. Something boring. What did you have for breakfast?" Protein bar, chocolate." "Was it good?" "It was disgusting. They always are." She had the wound packed and wrapped in under 2 minutes. "You're fine. Bones intact. No arterial involvement. Keep pressure on it and stay low." Kellens looked at her wrapped arm like she couldn't believe it. "How do you move that fast?" Claire was already moving. She didn't answer. The heavy gunner appeared at minute 14. He came from the ridge. The original position Claire had flagged, the one Pierce had logged and continued past. He was using a PKM, mounted on a bipod, and he had set up in a shallow depression about 680 meters out. At that range, in that terrain, with the dust and the heat shimmer distorting everything, he was functionally invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. He started working the convoy from the rear. Vehicle 8 took the first impacts. The armor held, but the tires on the right side blew out, and the crew bailed. Vehicle 9, the very last vehicle, the one farthest from any cover, was now exposed. Pierce heard the PKM and understood immediately that this changed the geometry of everything. A crew-served weapon at that range with that angle could work methodically through the entire column in the next 10 minutes if they couldn't suppress it. And suppressing it at 680 meters with small arms fire was not a realistic option. The effective range of their standard rifles was 450, maybe 500 with a good shooter in optimal conditions. These were not optimal conditions. He was still calculating the problem when he heard a single rifle shot from somewhere to his left. The PKM went silent. Pierce turned. Claire was behind Vehicle 4, prone, rifle propped on a rolled pack, cheek welded to the stock. She was chambering another round with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. She scanned the ridge through her optic for 2 full seconds, confirmed the target, and lowered the weapon. The PKM did not fire again. 680 meters. Desert heat shimmer, dust in the air, moving to a new position, under fire, while also managing 4 separate casualty calls. Pierce had been running infantry operations for 11 years. He had worked with some of the best shooters in the military. He had seen maybe 3 people in his career who could have made that shot in those conditions. He looked at Claire. She was already moving to the next casualty, rifle slung, medical bag open, completely uninterested in what had just happened. Around her, the firing was slowing. The western scrub line had gone quiet, either pulled back or down. The eastern element had withdrawn after losing the PKM gunner. The ridge was silent. The firefight was ending. Pierce stood in the dust and smoke and looked at the woman who had predicted the ambush, run toward the disabled vehicle, worked 4 casualties in 22 minutes, and just shot a crew-served gunner at nearly 700 meters with a standard-issue rifle like it was a routine training exercise. He didn't know what to say, so he said the practical thing. "Holt, get me a full personnel status, now." "Yes, sir," but his eyes stayed on Claire. They pulled the convoy into a defensive perimeter around the 2 disabled vehicles and waited for the QRF. It was 46 minutes out. 46 minutes in the Crimson Barrens after a contact, with limited comms and 3 contact points that might not be fully suppressed. It was the kind of wait that turns men quiet in different ways. Watts found Claire while she was checking Torres's pupils again. He came up beside her and crouched down without being asked, which was a thing people did when they weren't sure how to start a conversation. "That was a hell of a shot," he said finally. Claire didn't look up. "How's Kellen's?" "Arm's good." She stopped shaking. He paused. "I'm serious. I've never seen anyone. Get me the medical bag from Vehicle 3. Red Cross pouch, exterior right pocket." Watts went. He came back. He handed her the pouch. "You knew," he said. "Before it started. You knew." Claire looked at Torres. His pupils were equal, reactive. She made a note on her casualty card. The dust movement on the north ridge was wrong. Brush density on the western line was inconsistent with the terrain profile. Radio interference at a specific band with no structural explanation. She folded the card. It wasn't hard to read. It was for every other person in this convoy. She finally looked up at him. Her expression wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was the expression of someone who had been many places and seen what happens when people don't read things right. "Then they should have looked harder," she said. Watts had nothing to add to that. Pierce found her 20 minutes later, sitting apart from the main group on the shaded side of Vehicle 6, writing casualty documentation in the neat, rapid shorthand of someone who'd done it so many times the form was just memory. He stood there for a moment before she acknowledged him. 4 casualties, she said without looking up. Torres, concussion, moderate. Kellen's, GSW, forearm, stable. Brannick, blast overpressure, suspected rib fracture, needs imaging. Corporal Yates in Vehicle 8, shoulder dislocation from the bailout. I've reduced it, needs follow-up. She turned the page. All 4 are mobile and mission-capable pending medical review. Pierce sat down across from her. This surprised her. She glanced up briefly, then back to the form. "How long have you been a combat nurse?" he asked. A pause. "Officially, 3 years. And unofficially?" Another pause. Longer. "A while longer than that." "That's shot," Pierce said. "The PKM. That's not a medical skill set." "No." "So what is it?" Claire finished the last line on the form, capped her pen, and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. Her eyes were dark brown, steady, and completely unreadable. "Captain, I am assigned to this convoy as a combat nurse. My documentation is complete and accurate. My casualties are stable. With respect, is there something operationally urgent you need from me right now?" Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "Then I'll finish my reports." He stood, brushed sand off his trousers. He started to walk back to the main group, then stopped. "You called the ambush location before it initiated," he said to her back. "I logged it and continued." She didn't respond. "I should have stopped." She still didn't respond, but something in her shoulders shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. And then she turned back to her documentation. Pierce walked back to his vehicle. The QRF arrived 44 minutes later. 2 vehicles short of what was requested, one of them with a cracked windshield from its own separate contact 20 kilometers north. The Crimson Barrens was having a busy day. The recovery team began working on Vehicle 1, while Holt coordinated the casualty transfer. Pierce stood at the edge of the perimeter and called the preliminary contact report into Keller. He kept it factual. He did not embellish. He mentioned the nurse from Vehicle 7 and the shot at the PKM position and gave the grid and the estimated range. He could hear the pause on the other end of the line before the acknowledgement. Nobody asked him to repeat it. While the disabled vehicles were being prepped for tow, Ochoa came to find Claire. He stood near her for a moment, working up to something, and she waited. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "In the vehicle. When you flagged the ridge, we kind of blew you off. You called it in. After Watts talked himself into it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not the same thing." Claire was quiet for a moment, then, "The call went in. That's what matters." "It didn't matter," Ochoa said. "Pierce kept moving." "Pierce logged it. That matters too." She looked past him at the ridgeline, now just a low tan smear against the pale sky. "Sometimes logs are the only record of what people chose to ignore." Ochoa followed her gaze to the ridge. "Were you scared?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, the way people do when they decide an honest answer is worth more than a comfortable one. "Not the way you mean. There's a kind of focus that looks like calm from the outside." She paused. "It's not always calm on the inside." Ochoa nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand, but he filed it away. Quote, The convoy reformed and moved out an hour behind schedule. Claire was back in Vehicle 7, window seat, watching the desert. The scrub line was thinning again now, terrain shifting back toward flat exposure. The dust was clean, nothing moving wrong. Watts sat across from her again. He didn't say anything. He just kept glancing over with the expression of someone revising a position they'd held with more confidence than it deserved. Finally, "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Claire watched the desert. "Long time ago." "Military?" "Yes." "Where?" Silence. "Right," Watts said. He shifted in his seat. "That kind of thing." They rode without talking for a while. The engine noise was constant, the dust was thickening with the afternoon heat, and the desert spread out in every direction like something that had been making a point since before anyone was alive to hear it. Then Watts said, quietly, "I counted the shot. 14 seconds from when the PKM opened up to when you fired. You'd already moved position twice, triage Torres, and you were working Kellens when you heard it." He shook his head. 14 seconds. Claire said nothing. That kind of reaction, he trailed off, tried again. "That's not 3 years of nursing." She turned from the window and looked at him with an expression that was not unfriendly but was also completely without apology. "No," she said simply, "it's not." And she turned back to the window. Ahead, the convoy crested another rise. The road descended into a shallow basin, different from the morning one. Tighter, higher walls, denser rock formations flanking both sides. Better cover for a defender, worse exposure for a convoy. Claire leaned forward slightly. Her hand moved to her rifle stock. Old habit, pure reflex. Something shifted in the terrain on the western wall. It could have been the heat. It could have been the light changing. But her hand tightened on the rifle, and she began to count. Vehicle 3. Pierce was reviewing his map overlay when Holt reached over and tapped his arm. "Captain, Band 3 is active again." Pierce looked up. "And it's not us," Holt said. His voice had gone flat in the specific way it went flat when he wasn't sure how bad something was yet. "Multiple signals, different pattern than this morning." Pierce looked at the basin walls ahead, looked at the road running between them, looked at the distance to the far end of the pass. He picked up the handset. "All vehicles, this is actual. Reduce speed. 30 meters spacing. Watch your sectors." He paused. "Vehicle 7, Rowan, what do you see?" 3 seconds of silence on the channel, then her voice, unhurried, precise, without a trace of the satisfaction she was owed. "Western wall, 40 meters. Second rock formation from the lead. There's a position cut into the stone, freshly cut." A pause. "They were here before us. They've been here all day." The basin walls rose on both sides of the convoy. The road narrowed ahead. The afternoon light was going flat, and the shadows were getting long and heavy. Pierce stared at the western wall. He believed her this time. But believing her and knowing what to do about it were two completely different problems. And the convoy was already inside the basin, walls on both sides, no room to turn, and whatever had been watching them from that cut stone position had been watching them for the last 40 seconds of their descent. "Halt," Pierce said. "I know," Holt said. The radio crackled once, then went completely dead. The basin walls closed around them like a fist. The radio did not come back. Pierce keyed it 3 times in rapid succession, the standard check protocol, and got nothing but a flat, pressureless silence that was worse than static. Static meant interference. Silence meant something was actively killing the signal, which required equipment, which required planning, which meant whoever was in that cut stone position on the western wall had done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. "Holt, runner to Vehicle 9. Tell them to hold spacing and watch the east wall." "Yes, sir." Holt was already moving. The convoy had slowed to a crawl. Pierce's order had bought them distance between vehicles, which was the right call. But it also meant they were spending more time inside the basin with every second that passed. The walls were maybe 60 meters apart at the widest point. The road ran straight for another 200 meters before bending left around a rock formation that blocked the line of sight completely. They couldn't see what was around that bend. They couldn't reach Keller. They couldn't go back. The basin entry was too narrow to turn 9 vehicles, and reversing a convoy under potential contact was a different kind of disaster. Forward was the only option. Forward with a cut stone position on the western wall and a radio that had gone dead at exactly the wrong moment. Pierce climbed out of Vehicle 3 and moved at a low jog to Vehicle 7. Claire was already watching the western wall through her window. She had her rifle up, stock against her shoulder, using the optic to read the rock face with the methodical patience of someone who understood that rushing this particular observation would cost more than it saved. Pierce pulled open the rear hatch. "Talk to me," he said. "The cut is about 2 meters wide, maybe 1.5 deep. Natural shadow is covering most of it, but the rock color is wrong on the lower left edge. Fresh exposure. Somebody broke that face recently." She kept her eye on the optic. "No heat signature I can confirm without thermals, but the shadow density is inconsistent. Could be equipment, could be a body. Could be nothing. Could be." She paused. "It's not nothing." Pierce looked at the rock face. From where he stood, he could see the formation she meant, a jagged outcrop about 8 meters up the western wall, which at this part of the basin was nearly vertical. He couldn't see the cut from his angle. He believed her anyway, which was a shift he registered without dwelling on. "Options," he said. She finally pulled back from the optic and looked at him. "You need eyes past that bend before you commit the convoy to it. Send 2 people on foot along the wall. They'll have the rock face for cover, and the angle will let them see the position clearly from below. If it's occupied, you know before you move. If it's not, you've lost 4 minutes. And if they're already waiting past the bend, then 2 people on foot see it before 9 vehicles drive into it." Pierce considered this. "Who's going?" "I'll go." He looked at her. "I know what I'm looking for," she said. It wasn't an argument, it was just a fact, stated simply, without the salesmanship that people added when they weren't sure of themselves. "Take Ochoa," Pierce said. "Good. He's quiet." She was already getting out of the vehicle. Ochoa didn't argue when Pierce pulled him aside and told him. He just checked his rifle, tightened his chest rig, and fell in beside Claire without ceremony. He was the right choice for exactly the reason she'd identified. He had the specific physical discipline of someone who'd learned early that unnecessary movement created unnecessary problems. He moved like he was conserving something. They went along the base of the western wall, using the rock face for cover, moving in short bounds with the convoy at their backs. The stone was hot, genuinely hot, desert-baked through 10 hours of direct sun, and Claire pressed her hand against it briefly as she moved, using the texture to keep her bearing in the flattening light. The cut position was above them now. She looked up at it without slowing. From directly below, she could see the edge of a bipod, dark metal, partially retracted, braced against the interior wall of the cut. Unmistakable. She held up a fist. Ochoa stopped. She held up 2 fingers, pointed up, pointed at the cut. Ochoa looked, saw the bipod, gave her a single nod. She pointed forward, the bend, pointed at herself and at him, kept moving. They reached the edge of the bend and she went to a knee, back against the rock, and carefully put half her face around the corner. The road past the bend ran for about 150 meters before opening into a wider, flat area, the far end of the basin. She could see three things that she immediately cataloged in the flat, rapid way that years of fieldwork had made automatic. First, tire tracks in the sand, multiple sets, crossing pattern, heavy vehicles, recent. Second, a dark smear on the road surface about 70 meters out that was oil or coolant, which meant something had stopped there and idled long enough to leak. Third, a gap in the eastern wall at the far end, a natural crack in the rock, maybe 3 meters wide, big enough for people to move through in single file, which meant a staging point, an ingress route, a place from which things could appear very quickly. She pulled back and looked at Ochoa. He'd seen the tracks. She could tell from his face. She held up 3 fingers, 3 concerns, pointed back toward Pierce. He nodded. They moved back the way they came. Pierce listened to her report with the focused stillness of a man making calculations he didn't have enough data for. She gave it quickly, no editorializing. Bipod confirmed in the cut position. Recent vehicle traffic past the bend. Ingress crack on the east wall at the basin exit. They're using the basin as a choke point, she said. The position above us covers the entry. Whatever's past the bend covers the exit. Anything that comes in doesn't leave without going through both. Pierce looked at the wall, looked at the bend, looked back the way they'd come. If we go back, Holt started. We can't turn the convoy in here, Pierce said. We'd have to reverse the entire column and the entry's too tight for the cargo vehicle. There's a secondary road 6 kilometers back, Claire said. It adds 3 hours to the route and it goes through lower terrain, less cover, but it avoids this basin completely. You know this area? Pierce asked. I looked at the map this morning. Holt glanced at Pierce with an expression that was hard to read, something between impressed and uncomfortable. We'd need to know if that position is occupied, Pierce said. The one above us. If they haven't triggered yet, there's a reason. Either they're waiting for a signal or they're waiting for more of us, Claire said. Silence. There might be a secondary element coming from behind, she said. If the ambush is properly layered, they'd want the convoy inside before they seal the entry. That's why the radio went down. They don't want us calling for extraction before they're ready. She paused. They could be 2 minutes out, could be 20. Pierce looked at the road behind them. Long, open, dead straight for nearly half a kilometer. If something was coming from that direction, they'd see it. Nothing was visible yet. We move now, he said. Back the way we came. Holt, get runners to the rear vehicles. We're reversing in column. Cargo vehicle goes first. Claire, I need you to... The position above us, she said. If they're in it and we start moving backward, they'll trigger. Pierce stopped. They're waiting for us to commit forward, she said. The moment we reverse, they know we've made them. That changes their timeline. The basin was very quiet around them. Even the wind had dropped. The afternoon light was going amber now, cutting low across the rock face and throwing long shadows across the road. So what do you suggest? Pierce asked. His voice was measured. Not challenging, genuinely asking, which was not something he did easily with someone he'd been condescending toward 4 hours ago. Neutralize the position above us first, then reverse. She looked up at the cut in the rock. I can reach it from the wall. The rock face has enough texture. It's not a clean climb, but it's doable. If I go up the east side of the cut, I'm outside their field of fire and I have the angle. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. You're describing a solo climb on an active enemy position, Holt said. Yes. That's... Holt started. Ochoa goes with me, she said. He covers from below. If I don't make the position in 4 minutes, you pull back without me and call for fire on the cut as soon as you're clear of the basin and have comms. Holt looked at Pierce. Pierce looked at the rock face, then at Claire. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it. No. The climb took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The rock face was granite composite, sun-baked and dry, which actually helped. The surface was rough enough for grip and there was no moisture to make it treacherous. Claire moved in short segments, testing each hold before weighting it, keeping her profile as close to the rock as possible. Her rifle was slung tight across her back. Her hands worked independently of any conscious thought, reading the rock by texture and angle, finding purchase in places that wouldn't have looked like purchase from the ground. Ochoa stood at the base of the wall with his rifle pointed at the entry of the cut, cover position. watching her ascend with an expression of concentrated attention that was doing the work of about 15 different emotions simultaneously. She reached the lower edge of the cut at 320 and went flat against the rock, cheek pressed to the stone, listening, breathing. One person. The rhythm of someone trying to stay very still, which was different from the rhythm of someone who was genuinely still. There was a small shift of equipment, the tiniest creak of a sling, and then silence again. One occupant. That was manageable. She pulled herself up over the edge of the cut in one controlled movement. No hesitation, because hesitation on an entry was worse than going too fast. And she was inside in a second and a half. The man inside was young, early 20s, desert camouflage she didn't recognize, a PKM mounted on the bipod she'd spotted from below. He was lying prone, watching the convoy through a small optical sight, and he had exactly enough time to realize something was wrong before Claire had his weapon hand in his collar and his face pressed against the stone floor of the cut, with his arm torqued at an angle that made any rapid movement a poor idea. "Don't," she said, quietly, close to his ear. He didn't. She secured his hands with flex cuffs from her vest pocket. She carried them out of habit, the way she carried a tourniquet and a pressure bandage, because field medicine and field security had more overlap than people expected. And she disengaged the PKM's feed tray and removed the belt. She checked him for secondary weapons, a sidearm, a fixed blade, a radio handset. She keyed the handset. Static. Someone on the other end. A voice she couldn't parse through the encryption. She released the key and pocketed the handset. Then she appeared at the edge of the cut and looked down at Ochoa. She held up one finger. He exhaled visibly, even from 8 meters below. Getting back down was faster. The adrenaline metabolism was still working, and her body was warm and loose in a way that fear sometimes mimicked, and she didn't examine it. She reached the ground, Ochoa fell in beside her, and they moved back to Pierce at a quick walk. Pierce looked at her, at the flex cuffs on her empty hands, at the PKM belt she was carrying. "One occupant," she said. "Secured, radio confiscated." She handed him the handset. "They're coordinating. Someone else is listening to this frequency." Pierce turned the handset over. "You climbed an occupied position and took it without a gunshot." "Yes." Holt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The secondary element," Claire said. "We need to move now. Whoever's on this frequency will know something's wrong when the cut position stops checking in." Pierce was already turning. "Holt, column reverse, cargo vehicle first. Execute now. Move. The reverse took 9 minutes. 9 minutes of backing 9 vehicles through a narrow basin entry, cargo vehicle leading, which meant the most critical asset was the first thing exposed to whatever might be coming from the rear, which Pierce hated, but it was the only sequence that worked geometrically. Every driver used mirrors and runners and shouted distances. Twice a vehicle's rear corner kissed the rock wall and had to be corrected. The tension in the convoy was the particular kind that comes from knowing that the thing you're afraid of could arrive at any moment, and there is nothing you can do to go faster. The last vehicle cleared the basin entry with the daylight going red and thin. No contact came from behind. Either the secondary element wasn't as close as Claire had calculated, or they were watching and waiting to see what had happened to their cut position, or there was no secondary element and they'd reversed a 9-vehicle convoy through a narrow rock passage for nothing. Pierce didn't say any of this out loud. He got the convoy onto the open desert and stopped the column and stood in the cooling air and did his damage assessment. 1 prisoner secured in Vehicle 7, 1 PKM disabled and in custody. Radio handset of unknown encrypted type, 0 additional casualties. He looked back at the basin. The entry was a dark gap in the rock now, the inside completely shadowed. Holt came up beside him. She was right about the position. She was right about the secondary element timeline. She was right about the reverse. "I know." She was right this morning about the ridge. "I know that too." Holt was quiet for a moment. "Who is she, sir?" Pierce didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the way she'd climbed that wall. Not athletically, not impressively, but efficiently. With the economy of someone who had trained the fear out of this specific type of thing through enough repetition that it no longer registered as fear. That took years. That took a very particular kind of years. "I don't know yet," he said. but I'm going to find out. They made camp 3 kilometers from the basin in a shallow depression that offered some natural concealment from the west. It wasn't a good position. There were better options 2 kilometers further on, but the light was failing fast, and moving a convoy in darkness through unfamiliar terrain after a 2-contact day was the kind of decision that solved one problem by creating 3 others. Pierce set a double perimeter, rotated watch positions every 2 hours, and kept the radio cycling through frequencies in hopes of finding a band that wasn't being suppressed. Band 7 came back partially alive around 2100, enough to get a broken transmission to Keller, enough to confirm their position and status, not enough for a full brief or a QRF request with any kind of precision. The prisoner from the cut position was being held in Vehicle 7, zip-tied and seat-belted, and watched by a rotational guard. He hadn't said anything. He had a bruise on his cheekbone from the stone floor and a calm expression that suggested either training or resignation. Claire had done a cursory medical check on him, not because anyone asked her to, but because she did it automatically, the way she did everything that fell within the boundary of her specific competence, and had determined he was physically uninjured beyond the bruise. When she came back to the camp perimeter, Watts was sitting on a ration crate near Vehicle 6, eating something that smelled like it had been manufactured rather than cooked. He looked up when she sat down nearby. "You're going to tell me you've never done CQB either," he said. She looked at him. "Climbing that wall. Taking the position." He gestured vaguely with his spoon. "That's not medical school." "No." "So what is it?" She pulled her water bottle out and drank half of it before answering. "You're asking the wrong question." "What's the right question?" "Why someone with that background is assigned to a security convoy as a combat nurse." Watts put down his spoon. He looked at her differently now. Not suspicion, exactly. More like someone who had just noticed that the picture they'd been looking at had a detail in it they'd been consistently misreading. "Why are you?" She looked out at this perimeter. A guard was moving along the western edge. Specialist Brannick, ribs taped, moving stiffly but on his feet, which was a minor miracle, and also something she'd keep an eye on. He'd been favoring his left side all evening in a way that suggested the tape was doing about 60% of the work the ribs should be doing. "I asked to be here," she said finally. Watts stared at her. "You asked to be on a combat nurse assignment in the Crimson Barrens." "Yes. Why?" She didn't answer. She capped her water bottle and stood up and went to check on Brannick, and Watts sat with the question that had no answer and ate the rest of his manufactured food in silence. Pierce spent an hour with the operational map and a red light flashlight after the camp was quiet. He was working the secondary road route Claire had mentioned, the 6-kilometer detour, lower terrain, less cover. He was also working something else, a name, or the ghost of a name that had surfaced during his mental review of the day's events and refused to go back under. He'd been in a tactical briefing 2 years ago, a counterintelligence workshop at a location he wasn't going to think about too carefully, and one of the case studies involved an incident from several years prior. A special operations team had been cut off in difficult terrain. The mission was a failure by every metric. The team should have come home in boxes. Instead, they all came home, because a medic had disobeyed a direct order to evacuate and had instead, using a rifle she technically wasn't certified to operate at that level, according to the official record, held a position alone for 40 minutes while the rest of the team was extracted. The briefing had called it a case study in unsanctioned action producing favorable outcomes. It had used a call sign rather than a name. The call sign was Iron Wraith. The case study had also noted that the individual involved had been administratively separated from their elite unit shortly afterward. Protocol violation, insubordination. The citation was technically accurate and completely missed the point, which was something the military occasionally excelled at. Pierce folded the map. He thought about the wall climb, the shot at 680 meters, the radio read, the basin assessment. The way she'd said I looked at the map this morning, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He thought about a call sign he'd heard 2 years ago in a room he wasn't going to think about. Iron Wraith. He wrote nothing down. He turned off the red light flashlight and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the desert cool around him, and thought about what it meant that someone with that particular history was sitting 30 meters away, currently doing a quiet check on a soldier with taped ribs. because apparently she couldn't stop working even in a rest cycle. At 0140, the partial comms on Band 7 died again. Claire was on watch when it happened. She was positioned on the eastern edge of the perimeter, which gave her the longest sight line, nearly 400 meters of open desert before the terrain started rising toward a low ridge. She had her rifle up, scanning slowly, using the residual ambient light that a clear desert sky provided in amounts that most people underestimated. Sergeant Holt came up beside her at 0155. He moved quietly for a big man. "Can't sleep," he said. "I'm on watch." "I know. I'm adding myself to it." He settled in beside her, rifle up, scanning the western sector she wasn't covering. "Pierce thinks he knows who you are." She kept scanning. "Does he? He's not wrong, is he?" Silence. "I was at a briefing 2 years ago," Holt said. "Different briefing than the one I think Pierce is thinking about. Mine was about after-action debriefs from cases where protocol violations produced mission-positive outcomes." He paused. "One of them involved a combat medic holding a position with a sniper rifle for 40 minutes, alone. The desert in front of them was still, clean, no movement. The call sign in that briefing was different," Holt continued. "They used different call signs for different distribution levels." He looked at her sideways. "But the details were the same." She lowered her rifle slightly. Not in concession, just a natural pause in the scan cycle. "How many people saw that briefing?" "My distribution level, maybe 30. He paused. "But Pierce's briefing and mine are describing the same event from different angles, which means there are at least 2 separate documentation trails." He let that sit. "The system knows who you are. It's just filed you under the wrong category." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Holt began to think she wasn't going to respond at all. "The wrong category," she said finally. There was something in her voice that was too flat to be bitterness and too present to be nothing. "Protocol violation, insubordination, that's how the record reads." "That's how the record reads," she agreed. No inflection, just confirmation. Holt watched the western sector. Somewhere far away, a desert bird called once and went silent. For what it's worth, everyone I've talked to who knows anything about that mission agrees the decision was right. The decision got me removed from the unit. "Yes." "And the people I saved went home." "Yes." Holt paused. "Both things are true." She brought her rifle back up. "That's the problem with the system," she said. "It can hold both things true at the same time and still only act on one of them." Holt had nothing to add to that. He kept his sector and she kept hers, and the desert spread out in front of them, cold now. The heat gone out of it completely, and the stars above the Crimson Barrens were very bright and very indifferent to what happened below them. At 0340, Watts came to relieve them both. He looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had been thinking about something for several hours and still hadn't resolved it. "Sleep," he said. "You've been up since 0430 yesterday." She checked the perimeter sight lines out of habit before stepping back. "Wake me for the 0500 brief." "Obviously." She walked toward the vehicle. Watts watched her go, then looked at Holt. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked. Holt considered the question with more seriousness than Watts had probably intended. "She's been okay through things that would have broken most people," he said. "I think okay is probably the wrong word for her." Watts looked back out at the desert. "What's the right word?" Holt picked up his rifle and started his sector scan. "I don't know yet," he said, "but whatever it is, I'm glad she's on our side of the line." The camp was quiet. Vehicle 7 held a prisoner who hadn't moved. The perimeter held soldiers who were tired in the specific, accumulated way of people who had been afraid and focused and careful for a very long time. The secondary road was marked on Pierce's map in red, beginning 6 kilometers back, threading through lower terrain to avoid a basin that had nearly swallowed them whole. And in the pre-dawn darkness of the Crimson Barrens, a low sound moved through the desert from the north. Not wind, not the residual cooling of rock and sand. Engines, distant but multiple, and the bearing was wrong for any friendly route, and the direction put them between the camp and the secondary road, and Claire, half asleep in the back of Vehicle 7, opened her eyes in the dark and lay completely still for 3 seconds, listening with the absolute attention of someone whose body had never fully learned to stop working, and then she sat up. She was out of the vehicle in under 10 seconds. No boots. She'd slept in them. No fumbling for equipment. Her kit was staged the way she always staged it, chest rig draped over the rifle, both within arm's reach, because old habits didn't ask permission before they installed themselves. She was moving along the eastern perimeter before her eyes had fully adjusted to the dark, and she had her hand on Holt's shoulder before he'd processed the sound himself. North, she said. Multiple engines. At least 4, maybe 6. Bearing puts them between us and the secondary road. Holt was already turning. He heard it now. The low, unmistakable rumble of diesel underload, the kind of sound that meant heavy vehicles moving with purpose and without lights. How far? 2 kilometers. Maybe less. She looked at the northern horizon. No headlights. They were running dark, which meant they knew where they were going, which meant they had the camp's position. "Wake Pierce," she said. Holt was already gone. Pierce came out of his vehicle in the way that experienced officers came out of vehicles during night contacts, fully dressed, fully armed, mind already 3 steps into the problem. He heard the engines for himself, stood still for 4 seconds, and then started giving orders in a voice that was quiet enough not to carry and sharp enough to cut through the residual fog of interrupted sleep. "All personnel up, no lights, weapons ready." He moved to Claire. "Talk. They're north-northwest, running dark, which means they know our position. They're not coming down the road, wrong bearing. They're cutting across open ground." She pointed. "There's a shallow wash about 800 meters out, runs east-west. If they're using it for cover, they'll come up on the north edge of our perimeter, and they'll be inside 300 meters before we see them visually." Pierce looked at the wash, at the camp layout, at the 9 vehicles arranged in the depression that had seemed like reasonable concealment 6 hours ago and now felt like a box with the lid about to close. "How long?" he asked. 7 minutes? Maybe 8? Pierce looked at Holt. Holt nodded. The timing tracked. "Options," Pierce said. "We can't run," Claire said. "Not in the dark with 9 vehicles, 2 of which have mechanical issues. They'll hear us moving before we're clear, and they'll hit us in column on open ground." She paused. "We need to set the defense here. Use the depression walls for cover, concentrate fire on the wash line, and hold until Band 7 comes back or dawn breaks. Whichever comes first. If it's 6 vehicles, then it's probably 20 to 30 personnel." She kept her voice flat. "Our 40 minus the casualties is roughly 35 effective. Numbers are close enough. The defensive position helps us. And if the numbers are worse than that, then we hold anyway," she said. "Because the alternative is getting hit in the open." Pierce looked at her for a brief moment, not weighing her assessment, she realized. He'd already accepted it. He was looking at her the way people looked at someone when they were revising a fundamental assumption about them, and the revision was uncomfortable. "Get me Ochoa and Watts," he said to Holt. "Squad leaders to Vehicle 3, 90 seconds. So, OE 3, 90 seconds. The brief was fast because there was no time for it to be anything else. Pierce laid it out in under 2 minutes. Perimeter positions, fields of fire, casualty point at Vehicle 5, which was the most protected by terrain, communications protocol for when Band 7 came back. He assigned sectors. He checked comprehension with single questions that got single answers. Then he looked at Claire. "I want you on the north line," he said. "Not as a medic. Whatever else you are. I need it on the north line." The squad leaders, Watts, Ochoa, a staff sergeant named Derek Lamb, who had been mostly quiet for 2 days and now had the focused, compressed look of a man who was very good at his actual job, looked at her. She said, "The casualty point needs someone qualified to—" "Kellens can manage the casualty point. She's stable and she's trained." Pierce's voice was even. "I need you where it matters most." She held his gaze for half a second, then, "Understood." Lamb looked at Pierce. "Sir?" "She's a nurse." "She's something else," Pierce said. "Trust the read, Lamb." Lamb's expression said he wasn't sure he had a choice, which was accurate, and he let it go. They had 5 minutes left when the camp finished repositioning. The perimeter had collapsed inward and tightened. Vehicles pulled closer together for mutual protection, personnel redistributed to wait the north and northwest sectors where the wash would produce the threat. Brannick's taped ribs made him a liability for sustained prone position behind a rifle, so he went to the casualty point. Torres's concussion made rapid target acquisition unreliable, so he went to casualty point too. Everyone else was on the line. Claire took a position at the northwest corner of the depression, where she could see the longest stretch of the wash approach, and where the natural ground contour gave her about 40 centimeters of elevation over the terrain in front of her. She went prone, settled the rifle, looked through the optic. The desert was very dark. The ambient starlight was enough to navigate, but not enough to positively identify targets at distance. They needed the enemy to come to them, which was the plan. But plans that required patience also required patience not to erode in the final minutes. Watts was 6 meters to her left. She could hear him breathing. "You scared?" he asked, quietly, almost conversational. "Focus your sector," she said. "That's not a no." "Focus your sector, Watts." A pause. Then the sound of him adjusting his grip. The engine stopped. That was the moment that was worse than any of what followed, because when the engine stopped, the desert went absolutely silent, and the imagination filled that silence with everything it could generate, and most of what it generated was worse than reality. 6 vehicles going quiet at estimated 800 meters meant they were dismounting. Personnel on foot, coming forward, using the wash for cover exactly as Claire had predicted. And there was nothing to hear now, no engine noise, no way to track progress, just darkness and silence and the certainty that something was moving through it toward them. Pierce was at the north line, 10 meters east of Claire. She could see his silhouette and the rigid attention in it. He was doing his version of patience, which was noisier internally than hers but produced the same external result. 2 minutes of silence, then 3. The wash was 200 meters out. She was watching the northern lip of it through her optic, the elevation giving her a slightly better angle than the soldiers to her left. She was looking for the specific type of movement that human bodies made when they thought they were invisible, slower than natural, more deliberate, which paradoxically made them easier to spot against static terrain, because static terrain didn't have a cadence. She saw it at the 4-minute mark. A head, then a shoulder, coming up over the northern lip of the wash at the center left of her field of view. Then another one, 4 meters east, then a third. She keyed her radio twice, the prearranged signal for confirmed visual contact. Pierce keyed back once, acknowledged. She watched them come up out of the wash. They were using decent interval spacing, 3 to 4 meters between personnel, and moving in a staggered line that suggested some training. They had rifles up. They were wearing the same desert camouflage as the prisoner from the cut position. She counted. 8, 12, 15. More still coming up from the wash. She keyed 3 times. Threat count, significant. Pierce keyed twice. Understood. She put her crosshairs on the lead element and waited. Waiting was the hardest part. Not because she was afraid, because waiting with a sight picture while something moved toward the people behind you required holding every instinct in suspension, and instincts had opinions about that. Pierce let them come to 150 meters. Then, contact north. Weapons free. The first shots came from the left side of the line and the north line simultaneously, and then the entire perimeter opened up, and the desert that had been silent for 4 minutes was suddenly a very different place. The M240 on Vehicle 3 opened up on the center of the approaching line, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The advancing element broke into individual responses, some going flat, some falling back toward the wash, some pushing forward because they'd been trained that the worst place to be when a machine gun opened up was the open ground behind you. Claire worked methodically. Left to right, 3-round controlled pairs, shifting targets, tracking movement. The optic was earning its existence tonight. Without it, she'd have been working almost blind. With it, she could identify the difference between someone who had gone flat and stopped being a threat, and someone who had gone flat and was still moving. She engaged the ones who were still moving. 60 meters out, a group of 5 broke right and tried to flank the western edge of the perimeter. She saw it developing before it fully developed. The angle of their movement, the gap they were trying to exploit between Vehicle 4 and the depression wall. "West Gap," she said into the radio. 5 personnel, flanking. Lamb's voice came back. "I got him." He did. The M4 fire from his position redirected within 3 seconds, and the western flank push collapsed before it reached the vehicle line. The firefight developed into a grinding exchange that lasted 11 minutes. Not the explosive cinematic burst of violence that people who hadn't been in firefights imagined. Something uglier and more sustained than that. With position shifts and ammunition management and the constant exhausting demand of tracking multiple threats in degraded visibility, while also maintaining situational awareness of the people around you. 3 things went wrong. First, Ochoa took a round. Not fatal. It caught him on the left forearm, fractured the ulna, dropped the arm useless. But he was out of the fight as an effective shooter and was now a casualty that needed managing. He made it to the casualty point himself, which was something. Second, the M240 on Vehicle 3 jammed at minute 7. Operator error under stress. A feed tray issue that could be fixed in 45 seconds by someone who knew what they were doing, and about 3 minutes by someone who was scared and couldn't get their hands to cooperate. The gunner was scared. The suppression gap lasted 90 seconds before Pierce physically climbed onto the vehicle and cleared the jam himself, which was not what captains did and was exactly what needed to happen. Third, a secondary element came from the east. Not vehicles. They'd left those at the 800-meter mark. Personnel on foot, moving around the eastern flank while the main element held the convoy's attention on the north line. It was a reasonable tactic, and it nearly worked. They got to within 80 meters of the eastern perimeter before the watch position there. Specialist Riva Sato, who had been very quiet for 2 days and was apparently made of something harder than she looked, spotted them and opened up. Claire heard the contact call from the east line and felt the specific cold mathematics of it. The north line was still active. The east line was now active. The west gap had been suppressed, but might reopen. The perimeter had 9 effective shooters, now 8 with Ochoa down, distributed across 3 active threat vectors. The numbers were not good. She did the calculation in the time it took Pierce to say east contact into the radio, and then she made a decision that she did not have authority to make, and made it anyway, because the alternative was waiting for permission while the east line got rolled. North line, shift 2 personnel to east. Watts, Sato needs backup. Go now. Watts didn't ask who she was to be giving orders. He just went, pulling one other soldier with him, because the order was correct, and there was no time for organizational chart discussions. Pierce heard it from Vehicle 3. He looked toward her position. She was already repositioned to cover the sector Watts had vacated. The east contact was suppressed in 4 minutes. Sato and Watts and the 2 additional personnel pushed the eastern element back beyond effective range and then held, and the north line, thinner now, but still functional, kept the main element pinned beyond the wash. At minute 14, the firing from the north began tapering. Not all at once, in the ragged, disorganized way that suggested the attacking element was reassessing rather than withdrawing. Individual shots instead of sustained fire. Position changes. At minute 16, it stopped. The silence this time was different from the pre-contact silence. It had a different texture, the particular quiet of aftermath, which contained things the pre-contact silence didn't. Pierce's voice on his radio, "All positions, hold fire, sound off." The position checks came in, everyone accounted for. Ochoa was the only gunshot wound. The rest of the casualties were minor. Cuts from rock fragments, a bruised knee from someone who'd gone flat too hard on bad ground. Claire did a perimeter check with her rifle up, moving from position to position, taking in each soldier's status with a quick visual assessment. Watts had a cut above his left eyebrow from something, he didn't know what, that was bleeding into his eye and making him blink. She pressed a dressing against it without breaking stride. "Hold that," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Hold it anyway." She reached Pierce at Vehicle 3. He was standing on the vehicle's running board, scanning north with binos. He didn't look down when she approached, which meant he was still assessing. "Casualty check," she said. "Ochoa's the priority." "I'll get to him. Everyone else?" 7 minor. Nobody else is down." He lowered the binos. "You redirected personnel from my north line." "Yes." "Without authorization." "Yes." He looked at her. In the ambient light, his expression was difficult to read. Not angry, exactly. Something more complex than angry. "The east line would have been overrun." "Yes." So it was the right call. It was the only call. Pierce was quiet for a moment. The last person who made an unsanctioned tactical decision on my operation was a lieutenant who nearly got 6 people killed. I'm not a lieutenant. No, he said. You're not. He stepped down from the running board. Go get Ochoa. Ochoa's forearm was a mess. The round had caught him mid-radius and the fracture was complete. She could feel the instability through the skin without imaging, which was the kind of assessment that required experience she wasn't supposed to have in her current role. She splinted it with what she had, gave him something for the pain from the medical kit, and checked his grip strength on both sides. Left hand's going to be useless for a while, she told him. How long's a while? Weeks, maybe longer. He absorbed this with a stillness that came from somewhere deeper than just pain management. I need my hands. You have one. That's not... He stopped, looked at the splinted arm. Yeah, okay, he exhaled. You made the right call. The East Line. She was writing the casualty card. Don't talk about that. It was right. I know, don't talk about it. He watched her write. Why not? She finished the card and looked at him. Because the people in this unit need to keep believing that the correct order of events is officer decides, soldier executes. The moment that breaks down, you lose something that's hard to rebuild. She paused. Even when the officer is wrong. Ochoa thought about this. Is that what happened to you before? The question landed in the space between them and sat there. She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She capped her pen and stood. Rest, she said. Keep the arm elevated. What? Dawn came in stages, the specific incremental way desert dawn worked. Light arriving from below the horizon before the sun itself appeared, turning the crimson barrens from black to deep purple to orange in a progression that was visually extraordinary and that nobody in the camp had the bandwidth to appreciate. Pierce had the positions maintained until full light. At 0610, he stood the perimeter down to reduced watch and called the squad leaders together. He laid out what they had. Band 7 was still intermittent. They'd managed one full transmission to Keller in the last hour, enough to confirm position and request QRF, not enough to get confirmation of receipt. The secondary road was their best route option, but it now had an unknown number of enemy vehicles somewhere between them and it. Moving in daylight gave them visibility, but also made them visible. Staying put meant waiting for a QRF that might or might not have received the request. Lom said, "We wait." Watt said, "We move. Sitting here is, we don't know what's between us and the secondary road," Lamb said. "We move blind. We could drive into the element that just hit us. We wait blind. The next element comes to us." Pierce listened to this for a moment. Then he looked at Claire. She had been standing at the edge of the group, arms folded, not speaking. She looked like someone who had been waiting to be asked and had prepared herself to not push it. "Rowan," Pierce said. Everyone looked at her. She unfolded her arms. "Move, but not on the road." She pulled the map from her vest pocket. She'd taken it during the camp setup, another thing she'd done without being told to. "There's a track here, about 400 meters east of the secondary road. It's not on the mission map. It's a dry riverbed. Runs south for about 9 kilometers before it intersects the paved route to Whitmore." She spread the map. "It's rougher ground, slower, but it's below terrain on both sides for most of the route, which means we have natural concealment." "How do you know about a track that's not on the mission map?" Lamb asked. "I looked at the topographic overlay this morning. The riverbed is visible in the contour lines." She pointed. "This is where we are. The bed starts here. The vehicles can handle the terrain. I've checked clearance." "You've checked vehicle clearance," Lamb said. "Flat. Not hostile. Just trying to process the accumulation of things this woman had apparently done." "Yes." Lam looked at Pierce. "Sir, with respect, who is she?" Pierce folded the map. "She's the reason we're still here, Lam." He handed the map to Holt. "Plot the riverbed route. We move in 20 minutes. The convoy moved at 0640. Slow, careful progress along a dry riverbed that was exactly as rough as Claire had estimated, and not quite as impassable as Lamb had feared. The vehicles ground over rock and compacted sand at 15 kilometers per hour, which felt dangerously slow and was still faster than the alternative of waiting. Claire rode in Vehicle 3 now. Pierce hadn't said why. He'd simply told Holt to move her up, and Holt had done it. She sat in the seat Holt usually occupied, looking at the terrain through the forward windshield with the same quality of attention she'd given everything else. Pierce drove. He didn't usually drive, but the forward position in a single-file riverbed required someone who could read terrain quickly, and the driver he'd been using was Torres, whose concussion made rapid depth perception judgments unreliable. They drove without speaking for several minutes. Then Pierce said, "Iron Wraith." The name dropped into the vehicle like a stone into still water. Claire looked at the terrain. "That was the call sign," Pierce said. "In the briefing, 2 years ago." He kept his eyes on the riverbed. "A special operations medic. Held a position alone for 40 minutes. Saved an extraction. Got removed from the unit for insubordination." The riverbed curved slightly left. A rock cluster on the right side required a careful line. "That's one version of the story," she said. "What's the other version?" "The other version is that an officer ordered an evacuation that would have left 3 civilians in a kill zone. The medic refused the order, held the position, got everyone out, the team and the civilians, and was removed for refusing a lawful order." Was the order lawful? Technically. But wrong. She finally looked at him. "Wrong enough that 3 people would have died if I'd followed it." A pause. "That's not rhetoric, that's arithmetic." Pierce drove. The riverbed straightened out again, running south in a relatively smooth channel. "The briefing framed it as unsanctioned action," he said. "Positive outcome, but structurally it was a problem," she said. "I know, I understand why. The system can't function if people unilaterally override orders because they think they know better." She looked forward. "Most of the time, the system is right about that." "Most of the time." "Yes." She paused. "Most of the time." Pierce drove in silence for a while. The riverbed was narrowing slightly, terrain pressing closer on both sides, which gave them better concealment, but also meant they were committed to this line until it widened again. "Last night," he said, "when you redirected personnel from the north line." "Yes." That was the same calculation. "Yes." "And if you'd been wrong, the north line might have broken," she said. "And some of those people would be dead, and I would have been wrong." She looked at him directly. "I wasn't wrong." "You might have been." "I might have been," she agreed. "That's what the calculation is. Not certainty. It's never certainty. It's whether the odds of one outcome outweigh the odds of the other, and making that call with imperfect information in the time available." She looked back at the riverbed. "Sometimes you're wrong. That's what nobody in the briefing rooms understands. The people who make those calls know they might be wrong. They make them anyway." Pierce had nothing immediately to say to that. They drove. At the 6-kilometer mark, the riverbed began opening up. Terrain widening, the channel shallowing, the ground becoming something approaching navigable. Ahead, maybe 3 kilometers south, a line of low vegetation marked where the dry bed met the edge of cultivated land. The first sign of the Whitmore agricultural corridor that preceded the base by 15 kilometers. Holt's radio crackled. Then, a full, clear transmission. "Band 3, Keller Base. Confirming QRF dispatch. ETA 90 minutes. Route confirmation required." Holt grabbed the handset and started talking, reading back their position from the GPS, updating the route, giving the QRF the riverbed coordinates as a rendezvous point. His voice had the particular controlled relief of someone who hadn't let themselves feel relieved until the moment they had something concrete to feel relieved about. Pierce heard it and kept driving, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. Not much, just slightly. Claire heard the transmission too. She looked out the side window at the terrain passing, the riverbed walls dropping away, the landscape opening, the long flat approach to something that looked like it might eventually be civilization. She should have felt something uncomplicated in that moment. Relief, maybe. The satisfaction of outcomes matching expectations. What she felt was more complicated than that, because Keller had just confirmed QRF, which meant the emergency was resolving, which meant the operational period was ending, which meant the window in which she was simply the person who was useful, not the person with the complicated file, not the problem the system hadn't decided how to categorize, was closing. She watched the desert. "You'll have to write a report," she said. "I know," Pierce said. The shot, the climb, last night. She paused. The unsanctioned order. All of it. And the name. Pierce was quiet for a moment. I don't know what name goes in the report. She looked at him. The name on your assignment is Rowan, he said. That's what goes in the report. A pause. What goes in the report is that a combat nurse named Claire Rowan demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness, medical competency under fire, and sound judgment in multiple contact situations. He kept his eyes on the riverbed. That's the report. She looked at him for a long moment. And the rest of it? She asked. He drove. The rest of it goes in a separate document, one with a different distribution level. He glanced at her once, briefly. One that might take a while to find the right desk. The riverbed was almost gone now, the channel so shallow it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The convoy was approaching navigable ground. Ahead, the vegetation line was closer, 3 colors of green against the tan desert, the most promising thing she'd seen in 2 days. Pierce said, Iron Wraith. She looked at him. I've been in this uniform for 13 years, he said. I've been in 3 combat zones. I've worked with good soldiers and bad soldiers, and soldiers who were somewhere in between. He kept his eyes forward. I've never watched someone do what you did last night and not have a word for what it was. She waited. He said, the word I keep coming back to is necessary. The convoy came up out of the riverbed and onto flat ground, and the desert opened in front of them, and Keller was 90 minutes away, and the Crimson Barrens spread out on all sides in the early morning light, like something that had been testing them and had not yet decided on a verdict. Her hand rested on her rifle stock. Old habit, pure reflex. And she said nothing at all, because some things were true enough that saying them out loud would only make them smaller. The QRF arrived 87 minutes after the radio transmission, not 90, which was the kind of small miracle that only mattered in retrospect. 2 vehicles, 6 personnel. A medical officer named Lieutenant Shen, who had the clipped efficiency of someone who had done too many of these pickups and had learned to triage emotionally before she even stepped out of the vehicle. She went straight to Ochoa, looked at the splint, looked at the casualty card, and looked up at whoever had written it. Who did this? She asked. I did, Claire said. Shen looked at her, looked back at the card. The notation was precise. Mechanism, time of injury, intervention, current status, pain management with dosage and time. The splint itself was textbook. Maybe better than textbook, applied under conditions that made textbook difficult. You're the assigned nurse? Yes. Shen made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite skepticism and moved to the next casualty without further comment. She was thorough and fast and didn't waste words, which Claire respected. Pierce briefed the QRF commander, a staff sergeant named Briggs, who had the look of someone pulled off a different operation mid-stride. On the contact history, the prisoner, the route. Briggs listened with a notepad and asked 3 questions, all of them practical. He was not visibly surprised by anything Pierce told him, which meant either he'd been partially briefed or he had the professional composure not to show it. The prisoner from this cut position was transferred to the QRF vehicle without ceremony. He hadn't said a word in 14 hours. He got into the vehicle with the same calm expression he'd had since Claire had put him on the floor of the cut, and the door closed, and that particular thread of the story moved somewhere else. They reached Garrison Base Whitmore at 13:40 am. Whitmore was larger than Forward Operating Base Keller, a permanent installation with actual buildings instead of prefab modules, a flight line on the eastern perimeter, a medical facility that had functioning equipment and climate control, and the specific institutional smell of antiseptic over recycled air. Claire walked through the medical bay's intake area and felt the familiar dissonance of moving from field conditions to clinical ones. The way the body didn't immediately trust the change, kept itself at a low level of alert even when the threat was gone. She processed her casualties through intake. Torres, Ochoa, Brannick, Kellins, all 4 transferred to Whitmore medical staff with documentation that followed them. She briefed the receiving nurse on each case with the economical precision of a handoff, answered 2 clarifying questions about Ochoa's fracture, and was done in 12 minutes. Then she went and sat in a chair in the corridor and stared at the wall. She was tired. Not the performance of tiredness, the actual kind. The kind that lived in the body's connective tissue, and behind the eyes, and in the specific weight of limbs that had been running on adrenaline metabolism for 36 hours and had now been informed that the emergency was over. It hit differently when it arrived all at once like that. Watts found her there 20 minutes later. He sat down in the chair beside her without asking. He had a coffee, real coffee, base facility coffee, which smelled extraordinarily good, and he set a second cup on the floor next to her chair without comment. She looked at it. "Don't say you don't want it," he said. She picked it up. They sat without talking for a while. The corridor was intermittently busy. Personnel moving through, a supply cart, someone arguing about a form at the intake desk with the particular energy of someone who'd been awake too long and had chosen paperwork as the target for it. "Ochoa's going to be okay," Watts said. They said 8 weeks. 10, Claire said. "The fracture pattern, it'll be 10. Watts looked at her. "You told him 8. I told him weeks. He filled in the number." She drank the coffee. It was too hot, and she drank it anyway. 8 weeks is more manageable than 10 when you're lying in intake. The accurate number comes later, from someone with imaging. Watts absorbed this. That's kind of manipulative. It's medical communication. She paused. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She looked at the corridor. One is about control. The other is about what a person can absorb in a given moment. Watts was quiet. Then, "You do that a lot? Calibrate what people can absorb?" She didn't answer directly. In the field, you learn that the wrong information at the wrong time is as dangerous as no information. Panic is a physiological event. It has real consequences. And you never panic. She looked at him. "In 2 days, he said. "I never saw you." "I told you, it's not calm." She looked back at the corridor. "It's a different kind of noise." He sat with that, didn't push. "The cut position," he said finally. "When you came back down, you weren't even breathing hard." "I was breathing hard, you just weren't close enough." He smiled slightly. It was a tired smile, the kind that had some genuine thing underneath it. "I said some dumb things yesterday morning, in the vehicle. Yes, I'm saying I was wrong." She looked at him. "I know you were wrong. You know you were wrong. The apology is for you, not for me." She said it without heat. "I don't need it." Watts thought about this. "Okay," he said. "Fair." They finished their coffee in silence, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that took most people a long time to build, and which had arrived here through the specific shortcut of shared terrible experience. The debrief was scheduled for 1600. Pierce had requested it, which meant it wasn't optional for anyone on the convoy. The room was a standard briefing space, long table, 12 chairs, a display screen at the far end that was currently showing a map of the Crimson Barrens, with the convoy route and contact points marked in different colors. Someone with access to their communications log and GPS data had already been busy. 3 people Claire didn't recognize were sitting at the head of the table when the convoy personnel filed in. 2 were in uniform, a colonel and a major, both with intelligence branch insignia. The third was in civilian clothes, which in a military installation meant one specific category of things. Pierce sat at the near end of the table. He looked at the 3 newcomers with the controlled expression of someone who had expected this and was not pleased by it. Claire sat in the middle of the table, not at the back, not at the front. She chose a chair that gave her a direct sight line to all 3 newcomers and to Pierce simultaneously. The colonel's name was Hargrove. He had the built-in authority of someone who had been senior for long enough that rooms reorganized themselves slightly when he walked in. He was not unfriendly. He was also not here for anything comfortable. "I'll keep this structured," Hargrove said. "Captain Pierce, take us through the contact timeline from initial departure." Pierce did. Methodically, without embellishment, referencing the GPS log on the display screen at relevant points. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not minimize anything. He did not inflate anything. He included the first ambush, the ridge prediction he had logged, and continued past. The basin, the night contact, the riverbed route. When he mentioned Claire by name the first time, the ridge prediction, Hargrove's pen moved on his notepad. When he mentioned her by name the second time, the shot at 680 meters, The civilian at the head of the table looked up from his own notes and looked at her directly. She met his gaze without expression. Pierce finished. Hargrove asked 3 clarifying questions. The Major asked 2. Then Hargrove looked down the table. Specialist Rowan. It's not specialist, Pierce said. Her assignment grade is... I know what her assignment grade is, Hargrove said. Evenly, not correcting Pierce so much as indicating that the correction was unnecessary. He looked at Claire. Walk me through the basin assessment. She did. Tire tracks, oil stain, ingress crack, the logic of the choke point design. She kept it technical and sequential, no interpretation until she'd established the physical evidence. Hargrove listened without interrupting. The Major took notes. The civilian watched her face with the specific quality of attention that was about evaluating the person rather than the information. The cut position, Hargrove said. You climbed an occupied enemy position solo, with Ochoa covering from below. Solo entry, though. Yes. What made you assess it as a single occupant? Breathing pattern through the rock face. Equipment sound was consistent with one person managing a mounted weapon. The adjustment noise was singular, no second-person spacing in the sounds. She paused. And if it had been 2, the field of fire geometry would have been set up differently. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. You assessed field of fire geometry from the sound of a bipod adjustment. From the combination of sounds, yes. The civilian wrote something. The unsanctioned order during the night contact, Hargrove said. His voice hadn't changed. You redirected personnel from Captain Pierce's north line without authorization. Yes. Captain Pierce was the commanding officer of that operation. Yes. And you felt your assessment superseded his authority. Claire looked at him directly. I felt that the east line was 3 minutes from being overrun and that there was no time to go through a proper authorization chain. I made a call. A pause. It was the right call. It was the right call, Hargrove repeated, not agreeing, reflecting it back. With the available information and the timeline, yes. And if it had been wrong, then I would have been wrong, and people might have died because of my decision rather than because of the situation. She kept her voice level. I made the call anyway. The room was very quiet. Hargrove looked at his notepad. This isn't the first time you've made an unsanctioned call in an active operation. No. The incident with... I know which incident, she said. Yes. Hargrove looked up. You don't want to discuss it. I'll discuss it if you need me to. I don't think it changes the analysis of what happened in the Crimson Barrens. It provides context. It provides a pattern, she said, which is different from context. She paused. A pattern suggests I'm going to keep doing this. Context suggests I had a reason. Both things are true. The Major stopped writing and looked at her. The civilian had stopped writing too. Pierce, at the far end of the table, was watching with an expression that was very carefully neutral. Hargrove set his pen down. You were removed from Special Operations Medical Detachment 7 for insubordination. Protocol violation. The formal citation is 4 years old. Yes. And since then you've been assigned to general medical support roles. Progressively lower profile assignments. Yes. You asked for this assignment, the Crimson Barrens convoy. A pause. Yes. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because I was tired of assignments where nothing happened. Hargrove studied her. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening exactly, recalibrating. That's an honest answer. I try. He picked his pen back up. The shot at 680 meters, with a standard issue M4, in heat shimmer and dust conditions. Yes. The M4's effective range is... I know what the effective range is. Then you understand why I need you to explain how. She looked at the map on the display screen. I've been shooting at distance since I was 19 years old. I know how that specific rifle behaves at distance in heat conditions. The drop curve, the drift, the way heat shimmer affects the sight picture and how to compensate for it without a ballistic calculator. She looked back at Hargrove. It wasn't a difficult shot, technically. It was a difficult shot for someone who hasn't put 10,000 rounds through a rifle in field conditions. I have. Where? Various places. Hargrove looked at her. Classified various places. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the civilian. The civilian, who had not spoken this entire time, said, "We'd like to know what name you went by." The room shifted slightly, not visibly. Just the particular quality of attention changed, the way it changed when something that had been peripheral became central. Claire looked at the civilian. He was mid-40s, unremarkable face, the kind of person who was designed to be easy to overlook and who used that design professionally. "You already know," she said. "We'd like to hear you say it." The silence stretched for 4 seconds, long enough to be deliberate. "Iron Wraith," she said. Pierce looked at the table. Holt, who was sitting 2 chairs down from Claire, looked at the wall. Lamb, who was sitting across from her, looked at her with an expression that was trying to process something too large for the available space. Hargrove said, "The Special Operations Medical Detachment 7 mission, 4 years ago, the extraction." "Yes." "You held the position for 43 minutes. 41, she said. "The briefing rounds up. 3 civilians extracted in addition to the team." "Yes." "In direct contravention of the extraction order." The extraction order didn't account for the civilians. The officer commanding had incomplete situational awareness. The civilians were in a kill zone that would have been activated the moment the team extracted. She paused. "I stayed. The team extracted. I held the position until the civilian route was clear, and then I followed." Another pause. 41 minutes. "Alone," Hargrove said. "Yes." "Armed with whatever was available." She didn't elaborate. The civilian looked at his notes. "The after-action report on that mission has a classified appendix. The appendix was written by the officer commanding. It recommends your removal, which is what happened." He looked up. "There's a secondary document, filed by 3 members of the extracted team. It recommends a commendation. It was never processed." The room was very still. "I didn't know about the secondary document," Claire said. "No," the civilian said. "You wouldn't have." He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at Pierce. "Captain, for the record, your assessment of Specialist Rowan's performance during this mission." Pierce straightened slightly, not because he was uncertain about what he was going to say, because he wanted it to land correctly. She identified the first contact before it initiated. She managed 4 casualties simultaneously under fire. She neutralized a crew-served position at near maximum range. She identified the basin threat and executed the position elimination that allowed the convoy to withdraw. She made a tactical command decision during the night contact that prevented the east line from being overrun. He paused. She did all of this while listed on the manifest as a combat nurse, without being asked, without requiring authorization for any of it. And the unsanctioned order? Pierce looked at Hargrove. The east line would have been overrun. I was occupied with the M240 jam. She had the assessment I didn't have in that moment. A pause. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm comfortable with an unauthorized command decision in my operation. I'm also not going to sit here and tell you it was wrong." Hargrove wrote something. "For the record," Pierce continued, "I refuse to claim operational credit for the outcomes of this mission in my preliminary report. I identified Specialist Rowan as the primary decision-maker in the critical moments." He paused again. "That's unusual for a preliminary report. I want the record to reflect that it was a deliberate choice." Hargrove looked at him over the notepad. "I noted it, Captain." "What?" The formal debrief ended at 17:48. Personnel were dismissed in groups. Lamb's element first, then Watts and the vehicle crews, then Pierce and Holt together. Claire was asked to remain. She remained. Hargrove, the major, and the civilian sat at the head of the table. She sat in the middle of the table. The display screen had been turned off. Hargrove said, "I'm going to tell you what we know, and then I'm going to tell you what we're considering. You can respond afterward." "Understood. The pattern on your file is unusual. Progressively reduced assignments after the Detachment 7 incident, but performance evaluations that are consistently exceptional in every role you've held. Commendations that were written and not processed. A classified file that has more appendices than the main document." He paused. "Someone has been systematically managing your visibility." She looked at him. "I know." "You know." "I suspected. Knowing would require access I don't have. Who do you think? The officer commanding, Detachment 7. She said it flat. No emotion attached to it or emotion kept somewhere below the surface where it didn't affect the statement. He had the administrative reach and the motivation. The civilian said, "He retired 8 months ago." She looked at him. "The administrative management of your file effectively stopped 8 months ago," the civilian said, "which is approximately when your assignment request started getting approved instead of redirected." He paused, including the request for this convoy. The thing she felt in that moment was complicated, and she didn't examine it in public. She kept her face still. "What are you considering?" she asked. Hargrove folded his hands on the table. "Reinstatement, full-grade restoration, return to active special operations medical support with a classification level commensurate with your actual history." He paused. "There are units that need what you have, specifically and urgently." She looked at the table, at the empty display screen, at the chair where Pierce had sat. "The commendation from Detachment 7, she said. "The secondary document. We're processing it," the civilian said. "It'll take time. The officer who filed the original citation is no longer active, but the record—" "I don't need the commendation," she said. Hargrove looked at her. "I need the record corrected," she said. "The citation for insubordination. The factual record of what happened in that mission needs to be accurate, not favorable. Accurate." She looked at him. "There's a difference." "Yes," Hargrove said. "There is. If the record is accurate, the commendation can be whatever it needs to be." She paused. "The 3 civilians who came out of that kill zone, they were real. What happened was real. I don't need a piece of paper to tell me the decision was right." Another pause. "I need the piece of paper that says the decision wasn't what the citation said it was." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual priority." "No, it isn't," she said. "It's the only priority that matters. Everything else is career management." The civilian looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at the table. "The reinstatement offer," Hargrove said. "Take time to consider it." "I don't need time." He looked up. "I'll give you an answer in the morning," she said. "I want to sleep first." She stood. "Is there anything else you need from me tonight?" Hargrove looked at her for a moment. The look of someone recalibrating, again, the specific picture of who they were dealing with. "No," he said. "Get some rest." "What?" The bunk they assigned her was in the medical staff quarters, a narrow room with 2 bunks, a wall locker, and a window that looked out on the flight line. Her bunkmate was away somewhere. The room was quiet. She sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at the window. The flight line was lit by maintenance lighting, that particular bluish white that made everything look slightly unreal. A helicopter was being worked on at the far end, the maintenance crew visible as small figures moving around it with deliberate purpose. Normal work. Institutional life continuing at its ordinary pace. Pierce knocked on the open door at 2010. She'd heard him coming, boots on the corridor floor, the particular cadence of someone who was going somewhere specific and had rehearsed the approach. She didn't turn around. He stood in the doorway. "You doing okay?" "Yes." "The debrief?" "Was fine." He came in and sat on the opposite bunk without being invited, which she noted without objecting to. He had the look of a man who had something he wanted to say and was still working out the best approach. "They're offering you reinstatement," he said. "Yes. You already know what you're going to say." She looked at the flight line. "Yes." "Are you going to tell me?" She considered. "Not yet." Pierce looked at his hands. He had the hands of someone who'd been working in the field for a long time. Knuckles that had taken impact, a scar across the left index finger that she'd noticed during the debrief. "I put your name in the report the way it needed to be in there," he said. "No one else is claiming the decisions you made." "I know." "That might create problems for you with the reinstatement processing." "It might." "You don't care." "I care about accurate records." She paused. "I told Hargrove." Pierce nodded slowly. 4 years, he said, running from assignment to assignment in the system, asking for convoys in the Crimson Barrens because you were tired of assignments where nothing happened. He looked at her. "Why not push the record yourself? You clearly knew about the officer commanding. You could have—" I could have spent 4 years fighting a bureaucratic battle that would have required me to be angry about it every single day, she said. And maybe won, and come out the other end having spent 4 years being angry about a record instead of actually doing anything. She paused. I chose the second option. Working as a combat nurse. Working as whatever I was assigned to. And waiting. She looked at him. Waiting for the officer who managed my file to stop managing it. She paused. 8 months ago. Pierce looked at her for a long time. You knew he'd retire eventually. Everyone retires eventually. And you just worked, she said. Waited. Kept going. He was quiet. The flight line outside was doing its ordinary business. The maintenance crew had moved to the helicopter's tail section. Iron Wraith, he said. She looked at the window. The call sign, he said, in the briefing, 2 years ago. The instructor running the case study said, I'm paraphrasing, that the incident represented a failure of institutional support for high-value personnel that the military would eventually have to account for. He paused. He got a lot of pushback from the room. What did you think? Pierce considered. I thought the instructor was right, and the room was defending its own comfort. A pause. I also thought the person in the case study had made a unilateral call that complicated every legitimate authority structure in that operational context. He looked at her. Both things were true. Yes, she said. They were. How do you live with that? She turned from the window and looked at him directly. The same way you live with logging a contact report and continuing past the ridge, she said. Quiet. Not cruel. Just accurate. You do the next thing. You don't pretend the first thing wasn't what it was, but you do the next thing. Pierce sat with that. The helicopter on the flight line was being moved, the maintenance crew walking it back into the hangar on a tow bar, the rotor blades folded, the whole machine temporarily reduced to something manageable. Get some sleep, he said. He stood. Whatever you decide tomorrow, the reinstatement, it's the right decision for the wrong reasons or the wrong decision for the right ones. Either way, it's yours to make. She looked at him. That's an unusually philosophical observation for 2010 hours. I've had an unusually philosophical 2 days. He moved to the door, stopped. For what it's worth, the shot at 680. I've been running infantry operations for 11 years. He paused. I don't have words for that shot. She said nothing. I just wanted you to know that someone noticed, he said. Not the debrief, not the record, just someone saw it and it mattered. He left. She sat in the quiet room and looked at the flight line and felt the weight of 2 days settling into her body in a way it hadn't been able to while the operational pressure was still running. Not collapse, just arrival. The specific sensation of being somewhere long enough that the somewhere was real. In the morning, Hargrove would want her answer. She already knew what it was. She just needed the night to make sure it was the answer she actually wanted, and not the answer that was simply the next thing to do. And there was a difference, and she needed sleep badly enough that distinguishing between them required more clarity than she currently had. She lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. 41 minutes, alone, on a position in terrain she hadn't chosen in a situation she hadn't created, making a call that everyone afterward had opinions about. 4 years of managed invisibility. The Crimson Barons in 2 days of heat and contact and the particular texture of being dismissed right up until the moment when being dismissed became operationally untenable. And now a room and a window. And the ordinary sound of a military installation doing its ordinary work. She closed her eyes. Outside, the last maintenance crew member locked the hangar door, and the flight line went quiet, and the desert beyond the fence was dark and still and completely indifferent, the way it always was, the way it had been before any of this, and would be long after. She slept 6 hours without dreaming, which was the best she'd managed in longer than she could accurately remember. At 6:12, she was up, dressed, and standing at the window watching the flight line come alive in the early light. A transport aircraft was being prepped at the far end. Fuel truck alongside it, ground crew moving in the unhurried choreography of people who did this every morning and knew exactly where everything went. Ordinary work. She watched it for a while and drank water from her canteen because the base coffee wouldn't be available for another 20 minutes, and she wasn't going to wait in a line for it. By 6:40, she knew the answer wasn't going to change between now and 800 when Hargrove expected her. By 6:50, she had made peace with that. Hargrove was already in the briefing room when she arrived at 07:58. The major was there. The civilian was not, which she noted. On the table in front of Hargrove's position were two folders, one thin, one substantially thicker. The thick one had a classification marking on the cover that she could read from across the room. She sat down. Hargrove looked at her. "You've decided." "Yes." He waited. "I'm declining the reinstatement," she said. The room absorbed this. Hargrove's expression didn't change much. The recalibration was smaller this time, like he'd half expected it, and was adjusting the half he hadn't. "Explain your reasoning," he said. "The reinstatement puts me back inside a structure that removed me from making a decision that was right. The structure hasn't changed," she paused. "The officer who managed my file is gone, but the framework that let him do it for 4 years without review isn't gone. It's just currently pointed somewhere else. The framework has accountability mechanisms. The framework had accountability mechanisms when he was filing suppressions on my commendations," she said. "They didn't activate." She kept her voice even. "I'm not saying the system is irredeemable. I'm saying I don't trust it with myself specifically, based on available evidence." Hargrove looked at her. "So you'll stay as a combat nurse?" "I'll stay in the role I'm in until there's a reason to change it." "The role you're in is a significant underutilization of your capability." "The role I'm in is what I asked for," she said. "I've been useful in it." "Useful," Hargrove said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite irony but was close to it. "You held off 2 separate enemy elements and navigated a 9-vehicle convoy through a compromised theater with a casualty count of 1 non-fatal GSW. That's useful the way an artillery strike is useful. Colonel, with respect, the outcome doesn't change my answer." He looked at the thick folder, pushed it across the table toward her. "Before you finalize the decision, read the first 3 pages." She looked at the folder, looked at him. "The classification appendix," he said. "The secondary document from Detachment 7, the one that was never processed." He paused. "And an additional page, filed 2 weeks ago by the officer commanding that mission." She went very still. "He's been out of service for 8 months, Hargrove said. "Apparently he used some of that time to review his own record." He paused again. "It's a formal retraction of the insubordination citation, filed voluntarily. No legal compulsion." She looked at the folder. "He also filed a statement," Hargrove said. "It's on page 3. She opened the folder. The commendation from the Detachment 7 team was on page 1. 3 signatures, written 4 years ago in the clipped, functional language of people who had been in a situation and were trying to describe it accurately to people who hadn't. She read it in 40 seconds. Nothing in it surprised her. What it said was what had happened. That was enough. Page 2 was the citation withdrawal. 1 paragraph. Formal language. The specific bureaucratic phrasing of a military administrative document, but the substance of it was clear. The insubordination citation for the Detachment 7 extraction incident was being formally retracted on the grounds that the complete operational record, reviewed in full, did not support the citation as filed. Signed, dated 3 weeks ago. She turned to page 3. The statement was 12 lines. She read it twice. It wasn't an apology. It was close to one in places, but it stopped short of the word itself, which was either honesty about the limits of what the man could bring himself to say, or a deliberate legal caution. What it said, in the functional core of it, was this: that the decision to file the insubordination citation had been made in the context of protecting an operational structure that, in retrospect, did not warrant the protection at the cost it extracted. That the subsequent management of the file had been a continuation of the same error. That he was aware the correction came late. That he filed it anyway because late was better than never, which was a simple sentence and the truest thing in the document. She closed the folder. Hargrove was watching her. "The record is corrected," she said. "Yes." "That's what I asked for yesterday." "Yes." He paused. "The reinstatement offer is still open. Given the corrected record, it comes with a different grade than yesterday's offer. Senior grade. Fast track to a team lead position in a unit I can't name in this room." He waited. "It's a significant offer." She looked at the folder, at the closed cover with the classification marking. at her own hands on the table, not quite steady, which surprised her, and which she didn't hide because there was no one in this room worth hiding it from. "Give me the morning," she said. "You said that yesterday." "Yesterday I thought I knew the answer. Today I actually need the morning." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She found Pierce at the flight line at 0900, which was where Holt told her he'd gone. He was standing at the fence watching the transport aircraft, the same one she'd watched from her window, being loaded. Supply manifest, from the look of it. Boring cargo, nothing classified in Vehicle 5. He heard her coming and didn't turn around, which meant he'd been waiting for her. She stood beside him at the fence. "They made you an offer," he said. "Yes." "Good one? Senior grade, team lead, unnamed unit?" He was quiet for a moment. "Are you taking it?" She looked at the aircraft. "I don't know yet." "What changed from last night?" "The record," she said. The officer commanding filed a retraction. Pierce turned and looked at her. "He filed voluntarily 3 weeks ago." She paused. "The insubordination citation is gone." Pierce looked at the fence, at the aircraft, at something that wasn't quite visible. After 4 years. After 4 years. He was quiet long enough that a ground crew member walked past them and the aircraft engines cycled up a register and back down. "Does it change anything?" he asked. She thought about it seriously, the way she'd been thinking about it since she'd closed the folder. "It changes the record, which is what I said I needed." She paused. "It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the 4 years. It doesn't change the decision I made in that kill zone or the fact that it was right." She looked at the aircraft. "It just means the piece of paper says what happened instead of what someone needed it to say." "That's not nothing." "No, it's not nothing." She paused. "It's not as much as I thought it would feel like, either." Pierce looked at her. 4 years is a long time to want something." "Yes. And when you get it, it's the right size," she said. "It's just not as big as the wanting." He nodded slowly. That landed somewhere recognizable in him. She could tell from the way his shoulders settled. "The unit they're offering," he said. "Team lead." "Yes." "You'd be good at it." "I know." "Then what's the hesitation?" She turned from the fence and looked at him directly. "The last time I was in a structure with that kind of authority gradient, someone used the gradient to erase 4 years of my record." She paused. "That's a rational hesitation." "It is," he said. "It's also the kind of hesitation that, if you let it make the decision, you'll spend the next 4 years doing exactly what you've been doing, waiting for the next assignment where something happens." She looked at him. "I'm not saying take the offer," he said. "I'm saying the hesitation and the right answer aren't the same thing. They might not be pointing in opposite directions, but they're also not the same thing." She was quiet. The aircraft's engines were louder now, loading complete, beginning its pre-flight sequence. The ground crew was pulling the equipment back from the hard stand. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked at her. "What do you mean? After the mission report? After the debrief? After all of this?" She gestured vaguely at the installation around them. "What happens to you?" Pierce looked at the aircraft. "Keller debriefs me on the full mission, then another assignment. There's usually another assignment." He paused. "The report I filed, the one that puts your name on the decisions, it'll create friction. Some people at Keller aren't going to be comfortable with how it reads." "I know." "I filed it anyway." "I know that too," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her with an expression that was slightly uncomfortable with being thanked, the look of someone who felt they were being credited for something that should have been ordinary. "It's an accurate report." "Accurate reports aren't always the ones that get filed," she said. "You know that." He did. He didn't argue it. "What are you going to tell Hargrove?" She looked at the aircraft one more time. It was beginning to move now. Slow, purposeful, the nose swinging toward the taxiway. A machine with somewhere to be, doing what it was built to do, uninterested in the conversation happening 40 meters away. "The truth," she said. "Same as I always do." Boss it. She told Hargrove yes, not because the offer was too good to refuse. It was good, but that wasn't the reason. Not because the record correction had resolved everything. It had resolved the specific thing she'd asked for, and the ache that remained around the edges of it was something she'd carry regardless of what she decided. Not because Pierce's observation had been persuasive, it had been accurate, but accuracy wasn't the same as persuasion. She said yes because the 3 people who had come out of that kill zone 4 years ago had been real, and the 41 minutes she'd spent making sure they came out had been real. And the thing she was built for, the specific, irreducible combination of medical competency and tactical judgment and the capacity to stay functional when everything around her was not, was real, and spending it on assignments where nothing happened was waste. She was tired of waste. She told Hargrove this, more or less, in the direct language she defaulted to when something mattered enough to say plainly. He listened without interrupting. The Major took notes. When she finished, Hargrove looked at her for a moment and then said, "Good," in the tone of someone who had been waiting for a specific answer and was relieved to receive it. The paperwork took 2 hours. Ochoa was in the medical bay, arm in a proper cast now, sitting up in bed with the look of someone who had been given good pain medication and was philosophically at peace with the universe. He looked up when Claire came through the door. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." "How do you know I wasn't going to say something else?" "Because you had the look." He glanced at his cast. "New assignment?" "Yes." "Better?" She thought about it. "Different." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "How's the arm?" "They say 10 weeks. He looked at her. "You said that yesterday, and I thought you were wrong." "You thought I told you 8. You let me think that." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why are you here?" "To say goodbye. To check the arm." "And yes." She looked at the cast. The positioning was good. They'd set it properly. The alignment was what she'd managed in the field, translated into a clinical result. "The arm looks right." "High praise." He shifted slightly, testing the weight of it. "The East line. Last night." "Don't. I'm not going to thank you," he said. "I know you don't want that." He looked at her. "I just want to say that I saw it. The decision. What it cost you to make it, and what it would have cost everyone if you hadn't." He paused. "I saw it." She looked at him. Something in her face moved, just slightly, just for a second, in the specific way of things kept below the surface when the surface is under pressure, and then the pressure eases, and the thing below rises briefly before settling again. 10 weeks, she said. Calcium and protein. Keep the hand moving even when the arm's immobilized. She stood. "Don't let them tell you 8. He smiled. "I won't." She went to the door. "Iron Wraith," he said quietly behind her. She stopped. "I wanted to say it," he said. "The right way. Not like the briefings say it. The actual way." He paused. "It fits." She stood in the doorway for a moment without turning around. "Get some rest, Ochoa," she said. She walked out. Watts caught her in the corridor outside, which she suspected was not accidental. He fell into step beside her without asking. They walked toward the main exit. She had a transport arranged for 1400. Hargrove's people had been efficient about it, and Watts walked with her in the particular way of someone who had decided to use the time they had. "Where are they sending you?" he asked. "Classified." "Right." He was quiet for a few steps. "Will we see you again?" "Probably not." He nodded, took this without complaint, which was its own kind of maturity. "I've been trying to figure out what to say." "You don't have to say anything." "I know. I want to." He rubbed the back of his neck, an old habit she'd noticed, the gesture he used when he was working something out. "I came into this convoy thinking I had a pretty good read on people. Who was capable, who wasn't, how to tell the difference." He paused. "You were in the back of the vehicle, and I had you filed away in the wrong category inside 30 seconds. Most people do." "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at him as they walked. "But it's also not the thing that matters. The thing that matters is what you did when the category turned out to be wrong." He thought about this. "I called in the Ridge report." "After you talked yourself into it, yes." "And then Pierce ignored it anyway." "And then he didn't ignore the next one," she said. "People adjust. It's slower than it should be, but they adjust." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not angry about any of it?" I'm a lot of things, she said. Angry is in there somewhere. It's just not at the top. They reached the main exit. The morning light was strong outside. Full desert sun, the Crimson Barrens visible as a tan smear on the horizon beyond the installation fence. Watts stopped. She stopped with him. That cut on your eyebrow, she said. Keep it dry for 48 hours. It'll scar if you don't. He touched it instinctively. How bad? Small. You won't notice it in a year. She looked at him. Take care of yourself, Watts. You too. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm. Not performatively firm, just solid. The kind of handshake that meant something because it wasn't trying to. Whatever they have you doing next, he said. I feel sorry for whatever's on the other side of it. She looked at him for a moment, then something that was close to a smile. Not the performed kind, the real kind, which was smaller and less symmetric and much harder to manufacture. Get back to your unit, she said. He did. Pierce found her at the transport staging area at 1350, which gave them 10 minutes. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood beside her bag, one bag, military issue, worn at the corners from enough assignments that the wear had become structural, and looked at the transport vehicle and then at her. Hargrove told me you took the offer, he said. Yes. Good. She looked at the transport. The report you filed, the friction it creates, is my problem, he said. Not yours. He paused. I've had friction before. It resolves. Or it doesn't. Or it doesn't. Either way. He looked at her. I filed what happened. That's what reports are for. She picked up her bag. The transport driver was doing a final check. Another 2 minutes, maybe 3. The flight line beyond the staging area was busy with the morning's second wave of activity. Personnel and equipment moving in the organized flow of a functioning installation. The Crimson Barrens, Pierce said. 2 contacts in 2 days, a prisoner. A riverbed route that's not on any mission map. He shook his head slightly. I've had easier deployments. Most people have. And you picked this one deliberately. I picked this one deliberately, she agreed. He looked at her. There was something in his face that wasn't quite the debrief room expression, wasn't quite the in-the-field expression. Something more ordinary than both. The face of a person having a conversation rather than managing a situation. For what it's worth, whatever comes next for you, the record says what it says now, the right things. Yes, that took 4 years. Yes. That's too long, he said. The system should have... Yes, she said. It should have. She looked at him. But it didn't, and then it did. And now I'm standing here with a correct record and a new assignment, and you have a mission report that tells the truth. That's where we are. She paused. It's not a perfect place, but it's a real one. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Then he put out his hand, the same way Watts had, but different. The gesture carrying more weight because more had happened between them. More had been said, more had been understood that neither of them would put words to now. She shook it. Iron Wraith, he said. Rowan, she said. Just Rowan. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. He stepped back. The transport driver closed the rear hatch and came around to the cab. She got in. Halt. The transport moved through the installation gate at 14:02 and turned onto the road that ran south through the outer edge of the Crimson Barrens before connecting to the main route network. She sat in the back with her bag on the seat beside her and watched the installation recede through the rear window. The flight line, the buildings, the fence line, the ordinary machinery of a military base going about its morning. She watched it until the road curved and it was gone. The desert outside was the same desert it had always been. Heat shimmer on the flats, rock formations casting long shadows in the mid-morning sun. The particular quality of silence that was not actually silence, but the absence of human noise, filled instead with wind and heat and the deep geological patience of terrain that had been here before anyone and would be hereafter. She turned from the window and looked forward. The transport had another 4 hours before it reached the connection point where Hargrove's people would be waiting. 4 hours of desert road and her own thoughts, and the specific settling that happened when one thing ended and another hadn't started yet. She thought about the 41 minutes, not the debrief version of them, the real version. The texture of the rock face under her hands, the sound of her own breathing in the position, The calculation she'd made in real time about odds and outcomes and what she was willing to stake, which turned out to be everything, which turned out to be sufficient. She thought about the 3 people who had come home because of those 41 minutes. She didn't know where they were now. She never had. That was the nature of the work. You made the decision, you executed it, and then the people moved on into their lives and you had no visibility into what those lives became. You had to be okay with that. You had to do the work for the work itself and not for the accounting of it. She had always been okay with that. She thought about Ochoa's arm. 10 weeks, if he followed the protocol. Probably 12 if he didn't, which he wouldn't, because people with injured dominant hands always pushed earlier than they should. She'd told him 10 to give him a number that would make him careful. He'd be back in the field by winter. She thought about Watts and the cut above his eyebrow and the way he'd shaken her hand. She thought about Holt, who had stood a watch beside her in the dark and said things that were true without making them a speech. She thought about Kellens, who had looked at a wrapped wound in genuine surprise and said, "You move fast," and who was going to be fine. She thought about Pierce and the report he'd filed and what it would cost him and the fact that he'd filed it anyway, and the particular quality of that, which was something she recognized. The desert moved past the window. At some point in the 4th hour, the rock formations began giving way to lower, smoother terrain, the desert's edges, where the land relaxed into something less hostile. Green appeared, faint at first, then more of it, the beginning of the agricultural corridor that meant water and cultivation, and the human decision to build something in a place that required effort to inhabit. She watched the green arrive. Her bag sat on the seat beside her. Inside it, her kit, her documentation, 2 changes of clothes, a topographic map she'd kept because the habit was the habit. The rifle had been returned to the Whitmore Armory. She'd get a new one at the next assignment. She always got a new one. They were all slightly different, and she learned each one the same way, methodically, at distance, until the rifle's specific personality was known to her and the knowing was automatic. The transport slowed. Up ahead, a vehicle was parked on the road's shoulder. Dark, civilian pattern, 2 people standing beside it who had the specific posture of people who were waiting for something and knew it was coming. Hargrove's people. The next thing. She picked up her bag, checked the time, 17:49, 3 minutes early. She'd learned to be early. Being early was something you did when you understood that time was a finite resource and other people's time was as finite as your own. The transport stopped. She got out into the late afternoon heat, still significant, the desert not yet done with the day, and walked to the waiting vehicle with her bag over one shoulder and her eyes scanning the terrain in the automatic way she couldn't turn off and had stopped trying to. The person who stepped forward to meet her was a woman, mid-30s, dark hair, the efficient build of someone who maintained physical readiness as a professional requirement and not a hobby. She had the look of someone who had been briefed on Claire and was revising that briefing in real time against the actual person standing in front of her. "Rowan," the woman said. "Yes." "I'm Tessa Vance, team coordinator." She put out her hand. "We've been waiting for you." Claire shook it, looked at the vehicle, at the road ahead running south through terrain that was becoming increasingly ordinary, less dramatic than the Barrens, less obviously hostile, the kind of landscape that hid its difficulties better. "How long?" Claire asked. Vance raised an eyebrow. "How long have you been waiting for me specifically?" Claire said. "Not for this pickup, for the Whitmore report to come through, for Hargrove to make the offer." Vance looked at her for a moment, then something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly. Acknowledgement. 8 months, she said, since the file management stopped. 8 months, since the officer commanding had retired, since the suppressions had stopped, and the assignment requests had started going through. "And you knew about the file management," Claire said. "We suspected, couldn't confirm without the retirement." Vance paused. "We moved when we could." Claire looked at the road. 8 months of confirmed waiting on Vance's side. 4 years of everything else on hers. Both sides of the same gap, finally closed. "Okay," she said. She moved to the vehicle. "Tell me about the team." Vance fell in beside her. 7 people and mixed background. 2 medical, 3 tactical, 2 intelligence. Good unit. They've been short a team lead for 6 months. She paused. "They've been managing. How well?" "Well enough. Not well enough." She glanced at Claire. "They need someone who can do both, medical and tactical. Someone who can make the call when the call needs making. She paused. Hargrove said you'd understand what that means. The vehicle door opened. The interior was cool. Climate control, a luxury that felt temporarily disorienting after 2 days of desert heat. Claire got in. I understand what it means, she said. The door closed. The vehicle moved. The road ran south through the thinning desert, and the light was going amber and long in the way of late desert afternoons, warm and honest and entirely without sentiment. She sat with her bag on her knees and watched the terrain change, and felt the specific, quiet readiness of someone who had finished waiting. The record said what it said. The past was what it was. The 41 minutes would always be 41 minutes, and the 4 years would always be 4 years, and neither fact could be revised by any document or offer or handshake or absence of one. What could change was what happened next. She had always known that. She watched the desert give way to something greener, and she didn't look back, and the road ahead was long and ordinary and completely unknown, which was exactly what she'd asked for. Some people spend years being invisible not because they have nothing to offer, but because someone decided their value was inconvenient. The hardest thing isn't proving them wrong. It's deciding, after you finally do, that you were never waiting for their permission to begin with.